Let's pick this up. He's an academic, but he also becomes an administrator. He is certainly a perfect example of civilization and progress rhetoric, and a staunch supporter of the American conquest and colonization of the Philippines, which is going to last from the conquest until 1946. The Philippines is going to remain an American colony. But he's also an administrator, and he's also controversial. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about this? We have some pictures of him both doing his field work and sitting more in his administrative role. Can you kind of put this in perspective for us? You talked about, in your VC unit, Dean Worcester's world. Mm-hmm. What does that world look like to you?
Well, I think that world is captured nicely in this image that conveys Worcester's sense of himself as a person. He's the figure in the center of this photograph. He was a physically large man, but he was also an outsized personality with enormous confidence and ambition. And sense of himself. And I think it's fair to say that Dean Worcester's personal ambitions and the imperial ambitions of the United States intersected at the exact same place and time.
It's incredible that his book comes out in 1898, which is exactly when America is embarking on its own imperialist expansion.
In fact, it's important to remember very few Americans had even traveled at all to the Philippines before 1898, because it was at that point a Spanish colony. Most of very few Americans had been there. Worcester was there on a scientific expedition. His cultural expertise, his political expertise, sort of developed later. I mean, he came to study birds and animals. But then he turned that into cultural expertise. And in fact, that book he published in 1898, a lot of it is really just his own travel notes.
Well, remember one of Ellen's cartoons was a cartoon of McKinley looking at a globe trying to find the Philippines. Who were these people? And McKinley didn't know, so he turns to one of the few experts.
Yeah. And so just as in the previous unit, we looked at how Americans used photography to sort of understand the landscape of the Philippines to support the military conquest, we can see that here as well, as photographers like Worcester and people around him are using the camera to sort of understand and map both the landscape and the culture around them.
Chris, if we look at this photograph, it's a fascinating photograph also, because who's he surrounded with? Who are these people? Who tell us about the native peoples in the back row. Who are the people in the front row? Because they're obviously both Filipino and, I would assume, some of his American aides.
Yeah. In this photograph, according to the caption in the Worcester collection, is from a trip that he made to Isabela province, which is in the mountainous region of the Philippines, and a visit to the Ilonggot ethnic group. And we can see this as almost a press release, publicity photo of American colonial officials in the front row and Ilonggot community leaders in the back row. Worcester's position as Secretary of the Interior included sort of a portfolio of responsibilities. He collected power as much as he collected photographs and artifacts. And two of those included sort of supervising the Bureau of Science and then also the Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes. This term, non-Christian tribes, is developed by the American colonial officials early on to designate those parts of the Philippines that had not been Christianized, which is in fact actually a small fraction of the country. Colonial officials like Worcester sort of visited these regions and tried to sort of have very ceremonial interactions and then eventually very nitty-gritty political negotiations with the communities that they're meeting with.